6 weeks passed. 6 weeks of desperate preparation, of humanity pouring every resource into its defense. The shipyards worked without rest, crews sleeping in shifts, welding and building and repairing as fast as physically possible. New weapons were designed, tested, and deployed. Old weapons were upgraded. And every human being in the solar system knew that the Calvaxians would return. High Commander Zethrak stood on the bridge of his new flagship, the Destroyer of Worlds, and watched as 60 Calvaxian warships assembled in formation. The reinforcements had arrived from the homeworld, along with new orders from the High Council. The message was clear: crush the humans, make an example of them, show the galaxy what happens to species that resist the Empire. Our fleet is ready, Commander, Vextil reported. 60 ships including 4 Planet Killer-class dreadnoughts. Our shields have been modified to better resist kinetic weapons. Our targeting computers have been updated with human tactical data. And we have brought weapons that we did not deploy in the first battle. Good, Zethrak said. His burns had healed, but the scars remained. A reminder of his defeat. This time there will be no surprises. This time we crush them completely. The Calvaxian fleet entered the solar system, their approach detected immediately by human sensors. Alarms sounded across Earth's defense network. Ships that had been repaired scrambled to their positions. Crews that had barely recovered from the last battle rushed back to their stations. Captain Jake Morrison climbed into the command chair of the USS Defender, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. The ship had been repaired, most of her damage fixed, but she still bore scars from the last battle. Patches of different colored hull plating showed where repairs had been made. Some systems were still operating below optimal performance, but she could fight, and that was all that mattered. All stations report ready, Commander Pete Bradley said. Weapons loaded, shields at maximum, engines at full power. We are as ready as we are going to be. Fleet status? Jake asked. Lieutenant Amy Walsh checked her displays. 28 ships operational, sir. We built or repaired 14 ships in the past 6 weeks. But we are still outnumbered more than 2 to 1. Jake studied the tactical display. 60 enemy ships against 28 human vessels. The odds were worse than last time. Much worse. Pass the word to the fleet. Hold defensive positions. Wait for the Admiral's signal. Deep beneath Earth's surface, Admiral Helen Price stood in her command bunker, surrounded by holographic displays and senior officers. She looked older than she had 6 weeks ago. Her hair grayer, her face more lined. The weight of 12,000 dead pressed down on her every moment. They brought reinforcements just as we predicted, Colonel Greg Harper said. 60 ships. 4 planet killers. If they get close enough to Earth, they can crack the planet like an egg. They will not get that close, Helen said firmly. We have had 6 weeks to prepare. 6 weeks to build surprises. They think they know what to expect now. They are wrong. She turned to her communications officer. Send the message to all defense platforms, all ships, all weapons systems. Execute Protocol Prometheus Phase 2. Across the solar system, weapons came online. Hidden platforms activated. Systems that had been dormant for decades powered up. And humanity prepared to show the Calvaxian Empire what it meant to fight a species that had nearly destroyed itself dozens of times, and somehow always survived. The Calvaxian fleet advanced confidently, their formation tight and professional. They passed the orbit of Neptune, then Uranus, heading toward the inner system. Zethrax watched his sensors, waiting for the humans to reveal their defensive positions. Then space itself seemed to come alive with fire. The asteroid belt, that vast ring of rock and ice between Mars and Jupiter, had been transformed into the largest minefield in human history. Thousands of nuclear weapons had been hidden among the asteroids, waiting silently. Now they detonated in a carefully choreographed sequence, creating a wall of explosions that stretched millions of kilometers. Calvaxian ships caught in the blast zone found their shields overwhelmed by multiple nuclear detonations. Smaller vessels simply ceased to exist, vaporized by the heat and radiation. Larger ships survived but took heavy damage, their hulls scorched and systems failing. Evasive maneuvers, Zethrak shouted. Get us out of the kill zone. But the nuclear mines were just the beginning. As the Calvaxian fleet scattered to avoid the explosions, automated defense platforms throughout the system opened fire. Not just the X-ray lasers from before, but new weapons. Relativistic kill vehicles, chunks of metal accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed and aimed at specific targets. Directed energy weapons that had been built using stolen Calvaxian technology. swarms of attack drones even larger than before. A Calvaxian dreadnought took a relativistic impact to its port side. The kinetic energy was so enormous that the entire ship rang like a bell before breaking apart. Another dreadnought lost its main reactor when a swarm of drones penetrated its shields and detonated against critical systems. "This is not possible," Vextil said, staring at his tactical display in horror. "Where did they get all these weapons? How did they build so much in just 6 weeks?" "Because they were already built," Zethrax realized. "The humans have been preparing for this war for decades. These weapons were hidden, waiting for an enemy like us. Somehow they knew that eventually someone would come to conquer them." The human fleet moved to intercept, their ships coordinated by battle computers that had learned from the first engagement. Captain Lisa Monroe, who had lost her ship in the first battle, now commanded the USS Victory. She led a squadron of destroyers in a daring attack on a Calvaxian cruiser formation, using experimental warp drives to make micro-jumps that allowed them to appear, fire, and disappear before the enemy could respond. "They are using some kind of short-range teleportation," a Calvaxian captain reported to Zethrax. "Our weapons cannot track them. Our shields cannot stop them." "All ships fall back to secondary formation," Zethrax ordered. "Concentrate fire on their larger vessels. If we cannot track the small ships, we will destroy their capitals." The Calvaxian fleet refocused its efforts on the human cruisers and carriers. Plasma beams and particle cannons fired in concentrated barrages, overwhelming the shields of the USS Defender. Jake felt his ship shudder as the hull took direct hits. "Shields down," Pete reported. "Hull breaches on decks 3 and 7. We cannot take much more of this." "Then we make it count," Jake said grimly. "All weapons fire at will. Amy, send a message to Admiral Price. Tell her we are going down fighting." But Admiral Helen Price had one more surprise prepared. One final weapon that she had hoped never to use. Deep in Earth's oceans, hidden in underwater facilities that few people knew existed, bioweapon laboratories had been working for 6 weeks on a very specific project. The Calvaxian prisoners captured from damaged ships during the first battle had provided DNA samples, whether they wanted to or not. Human scientists had studied their biology, mapped their genetic code, and designed a pathogen that would target only Calvaxian physiology. It was a virus highly contagious with a long incubation period but a fatal outcome. Boarding pods launched from hidden platforms throughout the inner system. They were designed to look like escape pods, damaged and drifting. When Calvaxian ships picked them up, as military protocol dictated, they would find what appeared to be dead human bodies. But those bodies carried the virus, already released into the pod's atmosphere. "Biological warfare," Greg Harper said quietly as he watched the pods launch. "We are really doing this. We are fighting for our survival," Helen replied. "In survival, there are no rules. There is only victory or extinction. I choose victory." The battle continued to rage, ships burning and dying on both sides. But slowly, inexorably, the Calvaxian fleet began to falter. Too many surprises, too many losses, too many systems failing. And then the virus began to spread through their ships, invisible and unstoppable. Zethrax felt the first symptoms an hour into the battle. A slight fever, a headache, nothing serious. He ignored it, focused on commanding his fleet. But then his tactical officer collapsed at his station. Then another crew member. Then another. "Medical emergency on all ships," someone reported over the fleet channel. "Unknown illness spreading through the crews. Symptoms include fever, respiratory distress, organ failure. No known treatment." Zethrax understood then what the humans had done. They had weaponized disease. They had turned biology itself into a weapon. It was something the Calvaxian Empire had never encountered, something they had thought was beyond the morals of civilized species. But humanity was not like other species. Humanity had survived plagues and pandemics for millennia. They understood disease at a fundamental level, and they were willing to use that knowledge as a weapon. "Retreat," Zethrax ordered, his voice weak as the fever took hold. "All ships, full retreat. Get us out of this system. Quarantine protocols. Seal all ships." The Calvaxian fleet turned and ran, their formation shattered, their confidence broken. They had come with 60 ships expecting an easy victory. They were leaving with less than 40, many of those damaged and infected. They had lost thousands of crew members. The battle raged for 3 days. 3 days of constant fighting, of ships burning and people dying, of a war that neither side could afford to lose. The orbital space around Mars became a graveyard. filled with debris and frozen bodies drifting endlessly through the void. Captain Jake Morrison sat in what remained of the Defender's bridge, his uniform torn and stained with smoke. Half the consoles were dark, destroyed by enemy fire or system overloads. The air smelled of burnt plastic and something worse, something Jake tried not to think about. Of the 80 crew members he had started with, only 43 were still alive. Status report, Jake said, his voice hoarse from breathing recycled smoke. Commander Pete Bradley looked up from his damaged console. His left arm was bandaged and his face was covered in cuts from flying debris. Railguns are down to 15% ammunition. We have 3 missiles left. The main reactor is running at 60% efficiency. And our shields are held together with prayers and whatever Chief Kyle Stevens is doing down in engineering. How many ships do we have left? Jake asked. Lieutenant Amy Walsh checked her displays, her hands shaking slightly. 14, sir. We started with 32. We have lost 18 ships in 3 days. The Calvaxians have lost 12, including 2 dreadnoughts, but they still outnumber us. Jake closed his eyes and thought about the 18 ships that were gone. The USS Intrepid destroyed when its reactor exploded. The USS Guardian cut in half by plasma fire. The USS Freedom, rammed by a damaged Calvaxian frigate in a last act of desperation. Each ship represented hundreds of lives, hundreds of families who would never see their loved ones again. They are pulling back, Amy reported suddenly. The Calvaxian fleet is retreating to the outer system. Jake opened his eyes and looked at the tactical display. Sure enough, the remaining Calvaxian ships were moving away from Mars, accelerating toward the edge of the solar system. For a moment, Jake felt a surge of hope. Were they retreating? Were they finally giving up? But then reality set in. They are not running, he said quietly. They are regrouping, repairing their ships, and probably calling for reinforcements. Pete nodded grimly. That would be the smart move. Pull back, fix what is broken, and come back with more ships. How long do you think we have? Jake asked. Weeks, maybe a month if we are lucky, Pete replied. Not long enough to rebuild our fleet. Not long enough to prepare properly. Jake stood up slowly, his body aching from 3 days of combat. Then we use whatever time we have. Get this ship back to Earth. We need repairs, supplies, and rest. Pass the word to the rest of the fleet. Fall back to defensive positions around Earth. Let the Calvaxians lick their wounds. We will be doing the same. High Commander Zethrax stood in the medical bay of the Crimson Blade, watching his wounds being treated by an automated medical system. His chest was covered in burns from where his pressure suit had malfunctioned during his brief exposure to space. His pride was wounded far worse than his body. The casualties, Vextil, he said to his tactical officer. Give me the numbers. Vextil consulted his datapad, his expression troubled. We have lost 12 ships, including your flagship. Approximately 8,000 personnel dead or missing. Another 1,500 wounded. And most of our remaining ships have sustained damage that will take weeks to repair properly. And the humans? They lost 18 ships. Their casualties are estimated at 12,000 dead. Their remaining ships are heavily damaged. By all objective measures, we inflicted more damage than we received. And yet we are retreating, Zethrax said bitterly. And they are celebrating their victory. Commander, they fought better than expected, Vextil said carefully. Their weapons, their tactics, their determination. We have never encountered a species like this. Perhaps we should consider negotiating a peace treaty. Acknowledge them as equals rather than subjects. Zethrax turned on his tactical officer, his eyes blazing with anger. The Calvaxian Empire does not negotiate with primitives. We do not retreat. We do not admit defeat. We will wait. We will repair our ships and we will request reinforcements from the homeworld. Then we will return and finish what we started. Yes, Commander, Vextil said, bowing his head. But privately he wondered if Zethrax understood what he was proposing. To request reinforcements was to admit that they needed help. To admit that a single primitive species had fought them to a standstill. The High Council would not be pleased. On Earth, Admiral Helen Price stood before the United Council, facing the anger and fear of representatives from every nation and colony. The chamber was packed with people demanding answers, demanding explanations for the losses they had suffered. 18 ships, Representative Marcus Lane shouted, his face red with fury. 12,000 dead. And for what? To prove that we can fight? We already knew that. We have been fighting ourselves for centuries. The Calvaxians are not gone. Helen replied calmly. They have retreated, but they will return. And when they do, they will bring more ships. We need to use this time to prepare. Prepare how? Director Chen Liu asked. We have lost more than half our fleet. Our shipyards are working at full capacity, but it will take months to build new ships, years to replace everything we lost. We cannot win a war of attrition against an empire that controls dozens of star systems. Then we do not fight a war of attrition, Helen said. We fight a war of survival. We use every advantage we have. Our creativity, our adaptability, our willingness to do whatever is necessary to protect our home. You mean more secret weapons? Marcus demanded. More surprises that you kept hidden from us? What else are you hiding down in your bunkers, Admiral? What other lines are you willing to cross? Helen met his gaze without flinching. Every line necessary. Every line imaginable. You want to know what I'm hiding? I am hiding weapons that violate every treaty humanity ever signed with itself. Weapons we swore we would never use against each other. Bioweapons that target specific genetic markers. Cyber weapons that can turn enemy ships against themselves. Kinetic bombardment systems that can crack planets. And things even worse than that. The chamber fell silent. People stared at her in shock, some in horror. We built these weapons because we knew someday we might face an enemy that wanted to exterminate us. Helen continued. An enemy that would not negotiate, would not compromise, would not accept anything less than our complete surrender or destruction. The Calvaxian Empire is that enemy, and if we want to survive, we need to be willing to use every weapon in our arsenal. That is madness, someone whispered. No, Helen said quietly. That is survival. That is what humans have always done when faced with extinction. We do not go gentle into that good night. We rage, we fight, we claw, and we bite, and we make our enemies wish they had never challenged us. Marcus Lane shook his head. You are turning us into monsters. Maybe, Helen admitted, but we will be living monsters. The alternative is to be dead saints. I know which I prefer. The council erupted into arguments, some supporting Helen's approach, others demanding her removal. But Helen stood firm. She had been given command of Earth's defense for a reason. She had the experience, the knowledge, and the will to do whatever was necessary. In orbit around Earth, the USS Defender docked with a repair station. Jake Morrison watched through a viewport as repair crews swarmed over his damaged ship, cutting away destroyed sections and beginning the long process of rebuilding. His crew was being evacuated, sent planetside for medical treatment and rest. Chief Engineer Kyle Stevens approached Jake, his uniform covered in grease and burn marks. We can fix her, Captain. It will take time, but we can make her fight-worthy again. How long? Jake asked. 4 weeks, maybe 5. Longer if we want her back to full strength. We do not have 4 weeks, Jake said. The Calvaxians will be back before then. Kyle nodded. I know, but we will do our best. That is all any of us can do. Jake placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder. You did good work down there, Chief. You kept us alive when we should have died a dozen times over. Just doing my job, sir. Jake watched as his crew filed off the ship, heading toward the transport shuttles. They looked exhausted, traumatized, but alive. He had brought 43 of them home. 37 had not made it. Their names would be added to the memorial wall, alongside the thousands of others who had died in these 3 terrible days. Lieutenant Amy Walsh stopped beside Jake, her small bag of personal belongings slung over her shoulder. Captain, what happens now? Now we rest, Jake said. We repair. We prepare. And when the Calvaxians come back, we hit them even harder than before. Can we win? Amy asked quietly. Jake was silent for a long moment. Then he said, I do not know. But I know we will fight. That is what humans do. We fight until we cannot fight anymore. And then somehow we find a way to keep fighting. Across the solar system, both sides prepared for the next round. The Calvaxians sent messages to their homeworld, requesting reinforcements and explaining their unexpected difficulties with the human defenders. The messages were carefully worded, downplaying the extent of their losses, but the truth was clear enough. Humanity had hurt them, badly, and humanity prepared as well. Shipyards worked around the clock to repair damaged vessels and build new ones. Scientists developed new weapons based on what they had learned from the battle. Deep beneath the surface of Earth, in a bunker built to survive nuclear war, Admiral Helen Price stood before a holographic display that showed the entire solar system. Red icons marked the Calvaxian fleet, blue icons marked human ships, and far too many blue icons were flashing or had already gone dark. indicating heavy damage or destruction. "We are losing ships faster than they are," Colonel Greg Harper said quietly. He was Helen's second in command, a veteran of the resource wars who had seen more combat than most soldiers could imagine. "If this continues, we will run out of ships before they do." Helen's jaw was tight as she watched another blue icon blink out. The USS Valiant gone, 200 crew members dead in an instant. She knew most of them by name. She had attended their weddings, met their children, promoted them through the ranks, and now they were gone, vapor and debris floating in the cold of space. "The Calvaxians are moving their dreadnoughts into bombardment position," another officer reported. "They are preparing to fire on Mars. The colonies cannot evacuate in time." Helen closed her eyes for just a moment, thinking about the 4 million people on Mars. Families living in domed cities, working in mines and research facilities, trying to build new lives on humanity's first off-world colony. They had done nothing to deserve this. They were just ordinary people trying to survive. "Ma'am, we need to make a decision," Greg said softly. "If they bombard Mars, millions will die. But if we use Protocol Prometheus, we cross a line that cannot be uncrossed." Protocol Prometheus. Helen had helped write it herself 20 years ago when she first joined the United Defense Council. It was humanity's final defense, the weapons and tactics they would use only when facing complete extinction. Some people called it overkill. Others called it necessary. Helen just called it insurance. "They were warned," Helen said, opening her eyes. Her voice was cold, harder than steel. 3 months ago, when their first ships arrived, we told them what would happen if they attacked us. We showed them our history. We explained what humans do when backed into a corner. They laughed at us. "Admiral," Greg began. "Execute Protocol Prometheus," Helen ordered. "Authorization code Price Alpha 779. Send the signal now." Greg hesitated for only a second, then nodded. He moved to a secure console and entered the authorization codes. Across human space, hidden weapons systems that had been dormant for decades began to wake up. Systems so secret that even most military officers did not know they existed. Systems that humanity had built in the dark days after achieving interstellar flight, when they realized they were not alone in the galaxy, and that the galaxy was not friendly. Near Jupiter's orbit, hidden inside what appeared to be a research station, a massive weapon powered up. It was a nuclear-pumped X-ray laser, a device that used the energy of a nuclear explosion to create a beam of coherent X-rays that could burn through anything. The weapon had been built using technology from the Cold War, scaled up and improved with modern engineering. It drew its power from a small fusion reactor and could fire once every 30 seconds. The targeting computer locked onto the lead Calvaxian dreadnought, the one preparing to bombard Mars. The weapon fired. For a fraction of a second, a nuclear explosion occurred inside a containment chamber, and its energy was channeled and focused into a beam of X-rays that traveled at the speed of light. Commander Zethrax was reviewing the bombardment targeting data when his flagship's shield simply disappeared. One moment they were at full power, the next they were gone. Every generator burned out simultaneously. Before he could even ask what happened, the beam struck the ship's hull. The Eternal Dominion's armor, designed to withstand meteor impacts and energy weapons, might as well have been paper. The X-ray beam burned through it in less than 3 seconds, cutting the massive dreadnought in half. Atmosphere exploded outward. Bulkheads melted. People died without even knowing what killed them. Zethrax found himself floating in space, his command chair and a section of the bridge ripped away from the main ship. His pressure suit had sealed automatically, saving his life, but he watched in horror as his flagship broke apart around him. Half the ship exploded as the reactor containment failed. The other half tumbled away, lifeless and dark. What weapon was that? He screamed into his suit radio. How do they have such power? 2 more Calvaxian dreadnoughts died in the same way, their shields overwhelmed and their hulls burned through. The remaining Calvaxian ships scattered, their formation breaking apart as captains panicked and tried to find cover where none existed. Aboard the USS Defender, Jake Morrison watched the enemy fleet dissolve into chaos. "What just happened?" he asked, staring at the tactical display. Lieutenant Amy Walsh's hands flew across her console, pulling up data. New weapon signatures detected. They came from hidden platforms throughout the system. "I think Admiral Price just activated some kind of secret defense network." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had known that Earth had secret weapons, but he had never imagined anything like this. Weapons that could destroy a dreadnought in seconds. How many more were hidden out there? What else was humanity capable of when pushed to the edge? "All ships, press the attack!" Admiral Price's voice came over the fleet channel. "The enemy is in disarray. Do not let them recover. Drive them back." The human fleet surged forward, their confidence renewed by the destruction of the Calvaxian dreadnoughts. The USS Defender fired her railguns again, targeting enemy cruisers that were trying to reform their lines. Other human ships launched missiles, deployed more drone swarms, and used every trick they could think of. Captain Lisa Monroe, whose ship the USS Relentless had been destroyed in the earlier fighting, had survived in an escape pod. She floated in space, watching the battle continue through her pod's small window. She had lost her ship and most of her crew, but she allowed herself a small smile. Humanity was winning. Against all odds, they were actually winning. But Zethrax was not finished. He was rescued by a Calvaxian patrol ship and transferred to another dreadnought, the Crimson Blade. His pride was wounded, his confidence shattered, but his determination remained. The Calvaxian Empire had never lost a battle, never retreated, never admitted defeat. He would not be the first commander to break that tradition. "All remaining ships, rally to me," he ordered. "We still outnumber them. We still have superior technology. One weapon, no matter how powerful, cannot win this war. We will adapt our shields to block their X-ray attacks. We will develop countermeasures. And we will crush these humans once and for all." The Calvaxian fleet began to regroup, their ships pulling back to a safer distance while engineers worked frantically to modify their shield systems. The battle was far from over. Both sides had been bloodied. Both sides had lost ships and people. But neither side was willing to surrender. Jake studied his tactical display and saw the enemy fleet reforming. "They are not running," he said quietly. "They are preparing for another attack." Commander Pete Bradley checked his weapons status. "We are down to 60% ammunition on the railguns. Missile stocks are at 40%, and our shields are barely holding together. If they come at us again, I do not know how much longer we can hold them off." "Then we will hold them as long as we can," Jake replied. "That is what we do. That is what humans have always done. We fight until we cannot fight anymore, and then we fight some more." The USS Defender and the rest of the human fleet held their position, protecting Mars and the inner planets. Behind them, Earth continued to spin peacefully, blue and green and beautiful. Billions of people down there were watching the battle, praying for their defenders, hoping against hope that humanity would survive. Admiral Helen Price stood in her bunker, watching the tactical display. She had played her trump card, revealed weapons that were supposed to remain secret for decades. But she had no regrets. The Calvaxians had been warned. They had been given every chance to leave peacefully. They had chosen war instead. "Prepare the next phase of Protocol Prometheus," she ordered. "If they attack again, we hit them with everything we have. Every weapon, every ship, every dirty trick we have ever invented. We show them that humanity does not fight wars to win. We fight wars to make our enemies wish they had never started them." Greg nodded grimly. "Yes, ma'am." "Shall I authorize the deployment of the bioweapons?" Helen hesitated. Bioweapons were another line that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. But she thought about those 4 million people on Mars, about the billions on Earth, about every human colony scattered across the solar system, all of them counting on her to protect them. "Authorize it," she said finally. "Prepare everything. If the Calvaxians want to see what humans are truly capable of when defending their home, then we will show them. We will show them exactly why every war humanity has ever fought against itself has been so terrifyingly brutal. Because we know how to hurt, we know how to kill, and we know how to make victory so costly that the enemy wishes they had lost." The battle paused, both fleets catching their breath and preparing for the next round. In the cold silence of space, the warning that humanity had given echoed in Zethrax's mind. Some species should not be challenged. Some species, when pushed, push back harder than anyone expects. The Calvaxian fleet moved through space like a school of metallic fish, their formation perfect and unchanging. High Commander Zethrax stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion, watching the human ships scramble to intercept his forces. He felt nothing but contempt for these primitives who dared to refuse the Empire's generous offer of surrender. "Their defensive formation is weak," his tactical officer Vextil reported. "They have concentrated too many ships around their inner planets." If we push through their front line, we can strike at their homeworld directly. Zethrax nodded slowly. He had seen this pattern before. Species without experience in real warfare always made the same mistakes. They tried to defend everything and ended up protecting nothing. Target their command vessel, he ordered. The one they call Defender. Break their leadership and the rest will fall apart. The Eternal Dominion's main weapons came online, glowing with barely contained energy. Plasma cannons capable of melting through meters of armor in seconds, locked onto the USS Defender. Zethrax smiled. This battle would be over before the local sun set on the human homeworld. Aboard the USS Defender, alarms screamed as the sensors detected the weapons lock. Jake Morrison gripped his command chair tightly, watching the tactical display as the Calvaxian flagship prepared to fire. This was it. The moment that would define whether humanity lived or died. Evasive pattern Delta, Jake ordered. All power to forward shields. Prepare to return fire. Ensign Laura Hayes pushed the Defender into a tight spiral, the ship's engines straining against the sudden maneuver. But the Calvaxian weapons were fast, and the first volley of plasma fire struck the Defender's shields head-on. The bridge lights flickered as the shields absorbed the impact, burning bright blue as they struggled to disperse the energy. Jake felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. Sparks flew from a console on the port side and someone screamed. But the shields held. They were damaged, down to 60% power, but they held. Return fire, Jake commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. All batteries full spread. Show them what human weapons can do. Commander Pete Bradley's fingers flew across his weapons console. Railguns locked. Firing now. The Defender's railguns spat out tungsten slugs the size of telephone poles, accelerated to a significant fraction of light speed by powerful magnetic coils. These were not energy weapons. They were simple, brutal kinetic projectiles that relied on pure physics. Mass times velocity equals force, and the Defender's railguns had plenty of both. The slugs crossed the distance between the ships in seconds. The Calvaxian shields, designed and optimized to deflect energy weapons, barely slowed them down. The projectiles punched through the shields as if they were not even there and slammed into the hulls of 3 Calvaxian frigates. The results were catastrophic. The first frigate simply exploded, torn apart by the kinetic energy of the impact. The second lost its entire front section and began spinning out of control, atmosphere venting from a dozen breaches. The third took a glancing hit that ripped off one of its main weapon arrays and sent it tumbling through space. On the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, Zethrax stared at his tactical display in disbelief. What just happened? He demanded. How did their primitive weapons penetrate our shields? Fextel worked frantically at his console, pulling up damage reports and shield analysis. Commander, their weapons are not energy-based. They are physical projectiles moving at extreme velocities. Our shields are not configured to stop solid matter at those speeds. Then reconfigure them, Zethrax snapped. Adapt our defenses now. But adaptation took time and the human fleet was not waiting. All across the battle space, human ships opened fire with their railguns. More Calvaxian vessels took hits, their crews dying as hulls ruptured and systems failed. The perfect formation began to break apart as ships maneuvered desperately to avoid the incoming fire. Jake watched the tactical display with grim satisfaction. The first surprise had worked, but he knew the Calvaxians would adapt quickly. They had not conquered half the galaxy by being stupid. Lieutenant Walsh, signal the asteroid belt platforms. Execute Plan Gamma. Amy Walsh sent the encrypted signal, her hands shaking with adrenaline. Signal sent, sir. Platform activation in 30 seconds. Hidden throughout the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, dozens of automated defense platforms had been waiting in silence. They were a secret project, built over the past decade by Earth's defense industries. Each platform was small, barely larger than a shuttle, but packed with weapons and a simple AI brain that knew only one thing: destroy anything that was not human. The platforms activated simultaneously, launching clouds of small drones. Each drone was cheap, simple, and expendable. They carried a single explosive charge and basic maneuvering thrusters. Alone, a drone was harmless, but there were thousands of them, and they swarmed toward the Calvaxian fleet like angry insects. Zethrax watched in growing alarm as his sensors detected the incoming swarm. Point defense systems, engage those drones. Destroy them before they reach us. The Calvaxian ships opened fire with their point defense lasers, trying to shoot down the drones. They destroyed hundreds, then thousands, But for every drone they killed, 3 more took its place. The swarm surrounded the Calvaxian ships, individual drones too small and numerous to track effectively. Then they began to detonate. Hundreds of small explosions bloomed across the Calvaxian shields, each one individually weak but collectively overwhelming. Shield generators burned out under the sustained assault. Point defense systems overloaded trying to track too many targets at once. And when the shields finally failed, the drones began striking the hulls directly. A Calvaxian destroyer lost its main engines and drifted helplessly. A cruiser took damage to its command section, killing half the bridge crew. The Eternal Dominion's shields dropped to 40% as drones hammered against them relentlessly. How are they doing this? Zethrax roared. Their technology is inferior. Their weapons are primitive. Why are we losing ships? Vextil looked up from his console, his expression troubled. Commander, I believe they are using tactics we have never encountered. They sacrifice cheap unmanned systems to overwhelm our defenses. They employ weapons we have not cataloged. Our predictive combat algorithms cannot anticipate their actions because they do not fight like any species in our database. Zethrax felt something he had not experienced in years. Doubt. The humans were not supposed to be able to fight like this. They were not supposed to have weapons that could hurt his ships. They were supposed to surrender or die quickly. But instead they were fighting back with a ferocity and creativity that shocked him. All ships advance, he ordered. We will crush them with superior numbers and firepower. Activate the stellar disruptors. If they want a war, we will show them what the Calvaxian Empire does to species that resist. The Calvaxian fleet pushed forward, accelerating toward Mars. Their larger ships moved to the front, massive dreadnoughts with armor thick enough to shrug off railgun hits. Their weapons charged to full power, ready to bombard the human colonies below. Jake saw the enemy formation change and knew what it meant. They are going after Mars. All ships intercept course. We cannot let them reach the colonies. The USS Defender turned and burned hard, racing to put itself between the Calvaxian fleet and Mars. Other human ships did the same, abandoning their defensive positions to meet the enemy head-on. It was a desperate move, but there was no choice. 4 million people lived on Mars. 4 million men, women, and children who could not evacuate in time. The two fleets met in the space between Mars and the asteroid belt. Ships on both sides fired everything they had. Plasma beams and railgun slugs crossed paths in the darkness. Missiles streaked toward their targets only to be shot down by point defense fire. Shields flared and failed. Hulls ruptured. People died. Commander Pete Bradley fired the railguns until the barrels glowed red hot. We are taking heavy damage, Captain. Shields at 20% and falling. Keep firing, Jake ordered. We hold this line or die trying. A Calvaxian plasma beam struck the Defender's port side, punching through the weakened shields and burning a hole through 2 decks. Atmosphere vented into space, carrying bodies with it. Damage alarms shrieked. Fire suppression systems fought blazes in 3 different sections. But the Defender kept fighting. Her railguns kept firing. Her crew kept working, because they were human and humans did not quit. Not when their families were at stake. Not when their home was threatened. Not ever. Across the fleet, other human ships fought with the same desperate determination. The USS Relentless, commanded by Captain Lisa Monroe, made a suicide run at a Calvaxian dreadnought, firing its experimental warp drive at point-blank range. The resulting explosion destroyed both ships but took 2 enemy cruisers with it. The battle raged on, neither side willing to give ground. And in that moment, the Calvaxian Empire began to understand that they had made a terrible mistake. They had challenged humanity without understanding what that really meant. They had ignored the warnings. And now they were paying the price. The stars stretched endlessly across the black canvas of space, cold and indifferent to the drama about to unfold. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Defender, his hands gripping the railing as he watched the sensor displays flicker with new contacts. 20 alien vessels had just appeared at the edge of the solar system, their massive shapes blocking out the distant stars. Jake was 42 years old, a career military officer who had spent half his life preparing for this moment. First contact with an alien species, but this was not the peaceful meeting that humanity had always hoped for. The ships that now approached Earth were not explorers or diplomats. They were warships, bristling with weapons that Earth scientists could barely understand. Captain, we're receiving a transmission, Lieutenant Amy Walsh said from the communications station. She was young, barely 25, but her voice remained steady despite the fear Jake could see in her eyes. It's on all frequencies. They want us to hear this. Put it through, Jake ordered. The bridge speakers crackled to life and a harsh alien voice filled the room. The computer struggled to translate the words, but the meaning was clear enough. The Calvaxian Empire had arrived. They claimed ownership of the Sol system. Humanity had 72 hours to surrender completely or face destruction. There would be no negotiations. There would be no second chances. Jake felt his jaw tighten as the message ended. Around him, his crew sat frozen at their stations, waiting for his response. The USS Defender was Earth's most advanced warship, equipped with the latest weapons and shields that human engineering could produce. But against an empire that had conquered dozens of star systems, what chance did they really have? Send a response, Jake said quietly. Tell them humanity declines their offer. Amy's fingers trembled slightly as she typed the message. Sir, are you sure? Maybe we should wait for orders from Earth Command. We already have our orders, Lieutenant, Jake replied. Admiral Helen Price made it clear. No surrender, not now, not ever. The message was sent and the bridge fell silent again. Jake knew that back on Earth, billions of people were watching the news broadcasts, seeing those alien ships on their screens, wondering if this was the end of everything they knew. Parents held their children. Leaders made speeches about courage and unity. And deep beneath the surface, in hardened bunkers, Admiral Helen Price and the United Defense Council prepared for war. Jake had met Admiral Price once, 3 years ago, at a military ceremony. She was a tough woman in her 50s with gray hair and eyes that seemed to look right through people. She had fought in the resource wars, back when humans still killed each other over water and oil. She had seen the worst that humanity could do to itself, and she had sworn that if aliens ever came to threaten Earth, humanity would stand united for the first time in its history. The 72-hour countdown began. The Calvaxian fleet held position at the edge of the system, waiting. Their commander, High Commander Zethrax, sat aboard his flagship and studied the data his scouts had gathered about Earth. The humans were primitive by galactic standards. They had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. Their weapons were simple. Their ships were slow. This would be an easy conquest, another star system to add to the Empire's growing territory. Zethrax had conquered 12 worlds in his career. He knew the pattern well. First came the demands. Some species surrendered immediately, recognizing the futility of resistance. Others fought back, which usually lasted a few days before their defenses crumbled. Either way, the result was always the same. The Calvaxian Empire won, and another species learned its place in the galactic order. But Zethrax had not studied human history very carefully. If he had, he might have noticed something unusual about this particular species. Humans had nearly destroyed themselves dozens of times. They had fought wars that killed millions. They had built weapons capable of turning their own planet into a lifeless rock. And yet somehow they always survived. They always came back stronger, meaner, more determined than before. On the USS Defender, Jake watched as Earth's defense fleet assembled. 32 warships, ranging from massive carriers to small destroyers, took up positions around the major planets and colonies. It was not much compared to the Calvaxian fleet, but it was all humanity had. Every ship was crewed by volunteers who knew they might not survive the coming battle. Every captain had received the same orders: fight until the end, make them pay for every inch of space, and protect Earth at all costs. Jake walked around his bridge, checking on each station. Commander Pete Bradley handled weapons. His broad shoulders hunched over his console as he ran final diagnostics on the railguns and missile systems. Lieutenant Amy Walsh monitored communications, keeping Jake connected to the rest of the fleet. Ensign Laura Hayes piloted the ship, her young face set in concentration. Chief Engineer Kyle Stevens worked below decks, making sure the engines and shields would hold when the fighting started. These were good people, Jake thought. They deserved better than to die in a war against an empire they had never even heard of until 3 months ago. But fate had dealt humanity a cruel hand, and now they had to play it as best they could. The hours ticked by slowly. Jake tried to rest but found sleep impossible. He kept thinking about his sister back on Earth, about his nephew who was only 5 years old. What kind of future would that boy have if the Calvaxians won? Would he grow up as a slave? Would he grow up at all? At the 60-hour mark, the Calvaxian fleet began to move. They advanced slowly, maintaining perfect formation as they crossed into the inner solar system. Their course was clear. They were heading toward Mars, where 4 million human colonists lived in domed cities beneath the red dust. All ships, battle stations. Admiral Price's voice crackled over the fleet-wide channel. This is not a drill. Engage the enemy on my mark. Make every shot count. Make them remember this day. Make them regret ever coming to our home. Fight well and fight hard. Earth is counting on us. Jake took his seat in the command chair and pulled up the tactical display. The Calvaxian ships were larger, more powerful, and more advanced than anything in the human fleet. But humans had one advantage that the Empire had never encountered before. Humans were unpredictable, humans were creative, and when humans were backed into a corner with nowhere to run, they became the most dangerous species in the galaxy. All weapons charge and lock, Jake ordered. Prepare to engage. The USS Defender's railguns hummed to life, drawing enormous amounts of power from the ship's reactor. Nuclear-tipped missiles armed themselves in their launch tubes. Point defense lasers swiveled and tracked potential threats. The shields came online, surrounding the ship in a protective bubble of energy. Jake watched the enemy fleet grow larger on the view screen. Soon, very soon, the battle would begin, and the Calvaxian Empire would learn what humans had been trying to tell them from the start. Some species should never be challenged. Some species, when threatened, fought back with everything they had and nothing held in reserve. The warning had been clear. The Empire had ignored it. Now they would learn the hard way why humanity had survived every disaster, every war, every threat that had ever come their way. The first shots would be fired within the hour.